All right, we are at the cattle of the sun, and this is the next, couldn't even call it a chapter, the next story in the Book of Virtues, William J. Bennett, part of our bedtime story read, and our effort to get all the way through. So we're about this far. We have that far to go, but we're going to be so virtuous by the end of this. It won't even be funny. So quick recap, I'm doing this for the future kids I will have one day. If you ever want a bedtime story, it's my sneaky way of getting it to them, even if I can't be there. I don't know why I wouldn't be able to be, but say they're at a sleepover or I'm traveling or something's happening, and this is just a good way to stock up in a book that I have really wanted to read. My dad used to read me this as a kid. I remember certain stories, but not all of them. And yeah, I kind of just ended up with this book. I honestly think I took it from our family home through a series of moves, and I thought, well, I'd better take advantage of it. So here we are. Again, this is in the first, so he's got this divided up into different virtues. I have no idea what comes next. We have, so first is self-discipline, interesting. The next is compassion, then responsibility, friendship, work, courage, perseverance, honesty, loyalty, and I think and faith. Awesome. So we have quite a ways to go. So we will continue with self-discipline. And I think I'll read a story or two. Okay. The cattle of the sun. No pictures, sorry. If there are any, I will show you. But I don't think there are. And then we have David and Bathsheba next. So we'll see how this goes. Okay. Cattle of the sun. Times of plenty call for one kind of self-discipline, as in the story of the goose that laid the golden eggs. Times of hardship call for other sorts of self-restraint. Oof. I'm going to get my glasses. 10 seconds. Hang on. You know, I told myself I was never going to pause these because I'm such a perfectionist that they would never be good enough. And I found that out the first day I read. I was like, oh, that word was wrong. Oh, I mispronounced that. And I was like, you know what? For this project, we're just going to do it full run. So here we go. Specs on, ready to go. Times of plenty call for one kind of self-discipline, as in the story of the goose that laid the golden eggs. Times of hardship call for other sorts of self-restraint. During tough times, people are tempted to put aside social and moral codes. In this episode from Homer's Odyssey, the crew of Odysseus, or Ulysses, does not have the self-control to pass a tough test. The ship swept through the roaring narrows between the rock of Scylla and the whirlpool of, help me out here, Charybdis. How am I going to say that? Charybdis. Into the open sea, and the men, weary of heart, bent over their oars and longed for rest. Apologies if I'm butchering these Greek names. It's been a minute. Now a place of rest seemed near at hand, for in front of the ship lay a beautiful island, and the men could hear the bleating of sheep and the lowing of cows as they were being herded into their stalls. But Ulysses remembered that in the land of the dead, the ghost of the blind prophet had warned him of one thing. If his men killed and ate the cattle of the sun and the sacred island of Thrinacia, they would all perish. So Ulysses told his crew of this prophecy and bade them row past the island. Eurylochus was angry and said that the men were tired and could row no further, but must land and take supper and sleep comfortably on shore. On hearing Eurylochus, the whole crew shouted and said that they would go no further that night, and that Ulysses had no power to compel them. He could only make them swear not to touch the cattle of the sun god, which they promised readily enough, and so went ashore, took supper, and slept. In the night a great storm arose. The clouds and driving mist blinded the face of the sea and sky, and for a whole month the wild south wind hurled the waves on the coast, and no ship of these times could venture out in the tempest. Meanwhile, the crew ate up all the stores in the ship and finished the wine, so that they were driven to catch seabirds and fishes, of which they took but few, the sea being so rough upon the rocks. Ulysses went up to the island alone to pray to the gods, and when he had prayed, he found a sheltered place, and there he fell asleep. Eurylochus took the occasion while Ulysses was away to bid the crew seize and slay the sacred cattle of the sun god, which no man might touch. And this they did, so that when Ulysses wakened and came near the ship, he smelled the roast meat and knew what had been done. He rebuked the men, but as the cattle were dead, they kept eating them for 6 days. And then the storm ceased, and the wind fell, the sun shone, and they set sail, and away they went. But this evil deed was punished, for when they were out of sight of land, a great thundercloud overshadowed them. The wind broke the mast, which crushed the head of the helmsman. The lightning struck the ship in the center. She reeled. The men fell overboard. The heads of the crew floated a moment, like cormorants above the waves. But Ulysses had kept a hold of a rope, and when the vessel righted, he walked the deck till a wave stripped off all the tackling and loosened the sides from the keel. Ulysses had only time to lash the broken mast with a rope to the keel and sit on a raft with his feet in the water, while the south wind rose again furiously and drove the raft back till it came under the rock where was the whirlpool of Charybdis. Here Ulysses would have been drowned, but he caught at the root of a fig tree that grew on the rock, and there he hung, clinging with his toes to the crumbling stones till the whirlpool boiled up again, and up came the timbers. Down on the timbers Ulysses dropped, and so sat rowing with his hands, and the wind drifted him at last to a shelving beach of an island. All of that to say you shouldn't eat the cattle of the sun god, and that they didn't have the self-discipline, and that there were consequences. So interesting. I mean, even, I digress a bit perhaps, but it's just interesting because there was a quote, I think it was by, oh geez, I can't remember. William Shatner is coming to mind, and it is absolutely not him. Faulkner, William Faulkner. When he was accepting, I think, the Nobel Prize for Literature, he basically said something like, what are we writing about if not great morals, if not the backbone of humanity, if not, toil and pain and sorrow and loyalty and these huge human endeavors that are worth writing about. I'll have to read the quote some other time. I actually think it's in this book. And this reminds me, like, the whole point of Greek mythology, and I'm sure stories that have stood the test of time, or they stand it for a reason. So I think it's a very simple principle that they taught, but I like it. Okay, so anyway, here we go. David and Bathsheba. I think I've got time for one more. We're told by Jesse Lyman Hurlbert. Of all the vices, lust is the one that many people seem to find the most difficult to control. The story of David and Bathsheba is from the second book of Samuel in the Bible. Okay, that was a preface. When David first became king, he went with his army upon the wars against the enemies of Israel. But there came a time when the cares of his kingdom were many, and David left Joab, his general, to lead his warriors while he stayed in his palace on Mount Zion. One evening about sunset, David was walking upon the roof of his palace. He looked down into a garden nearby and saw a woman who was very beautiful. David asked one of his servants who this woman was, and he said to him, her name is Bathsheba, and she's the wife of Uriah. Uriah was an officer in David's army under Joab. At the time, he was fighting in David's war against the Ammonites at Rabbah, near the desert on the east of Jordan. David sent for Uriah's wife Bathsheba and talked with her. He loved her and greatly longed to take her as one of his own wives. For in those times, it was not thought a sin for a man to have more than one wife. But David could not marry Bathsheba while her husband Uriah was living. Then, okay, so this is kind of like kid version, right? He sees her bathing on a roof. He calls her to him. They sleep together, and then all this happened. Then a wicked thought came into David's heart, and he formed a plan to have Uriah killed, so he wouldn't find out that he slept with his wife, so that he could then take Bathsheba into his own house, to put it lightly. David wrote a letter to Joab, the commander of his army. In the letter he said, when there is to be a fight with the Ammonites, send Uriah into the middle of it, where it will be the hottest, and manage to leave him there, so that he may be slain by the Ammonites. And Joab did as David commanded him. He sent Uriah with some brave men to a place near the wall of the city, where he knew that the enemies would rush out of the city upon them. There was a fierce fight beside the wall. Uriah was slain, and other brave men with him. Then Joab sent a messenger to tell King David how the war was being carried on, and especially that Uriah, one of his brave officers, had been killed in the fighting. When David heard this, he said to the messenger, say to Joab, do not feel troubled at the loss of the men slain in battle. The sword must strike down some. Keep up the siege, press forward, and you'll take the city. And after Bathsheba had mourned over her husband's death for a time, David took her into his palace, and she became his wife. A little child was born to them, whom David loved greatly. Only Joab and David, and perhaps a few others. I always wondered, did Bathsheba never know? Did he never tell her after all of those years, hey, I was part in killing her? I mean, he had to have. Maybe I just need to read that part again in Samuel, but I don't really know the answer. Did he ever tell her? Could he keep it from her? That must have eaten him up. That and a bunch of other things. Okay, here we go. And a little child was born to them, okay, whom David loved greatly. Only Joab and David, and perhaps a few others, knew that David had caused the death of Uriah, but God knew it, and God was displeased with David for this wicked deed. Then the Lord sent Nathan, the prophet, to David to tell him that, though men knew not that David had done wickedly, God had seen it, and he would surely punish David for his sin. Nathan came to David, and he spoke with him thus. There were 2 men in the city. One was rich and the other poor. The rich man had great flocks of sheep and herds of cattle, but the poor man had only one little lamb that he bought. It grew up in his home with his children, drank out of his cup, lay on his lap, and was like a daughter to him. One day, a visitor came to the rich man's house to dinner. The rich man did not take one of his own sheep to kill for the guest. He robbed the poor man of his lamb and killed it and cooked it for a meal with his friend. When David heard this, he was very angry. He said to Nathan, the man who did this thing deserves to die. He shall give back to his poor neighbor 4-fold for the lamb taken from him. How cruel to treat a poor man thus without pity for him. And Nathan said to David, you are the man who has done this deed. The Lord made you king in place of Saul, and gave you a kingdom. You have a great house and many wives. Why then have you done this wickedness in the sight of the Lord? You have slain Uriah with the sword of the men of Ammon. You have taken his wife to be your wife. For this there shall be a sword drawn against your house. You shall suffer for it, and your wife shall suffer, and your children shall suffer, because you have done this. When David heard this, he saw, as he had not seen before, how great was his wickedness. He was exceedingly sorry and said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And David showed such sorrow for his sin that Nathan said to him, the Lord has forgiven your sin, and you shall not die on account of it. But the child that Uriah's wife has given you shall surely die. It's like a fairy tale or something. Soon after this, the little child of David and Bathsheba, whom David loved greatly, was taken very ill. David prayed to God for the child's life, and David took no food, but lay in sorrow with his face upon the floor of his house. The nobles of his palace came to him and urged him to rise up and take food, but he would not. For 7 days the child grew worse and worse. I don't remember this part. And David remained in sorrow. Then the child died. I always thought David's child was Solomon or something. Shows you how much I have yet to read. And David remained in sorrow. Then the child died, and the nobles were afraid to tell David, for they said to each other, if he was in such grief while the child was living, what is he going to do when he hears the child is dead? When King David saw the people whispering with sad faces, he said, is the child dead? And they said to him, yes, O king, the child is dead. Then David rose up from the floor where he had been lying, washed his face, and put on his kingly robes. He went first to the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he came to his own house and sat down to his table and took food. His servants wondered at it. But David said to them, while the child was still alive, I fasted and prayed and wept. For I hoped that by prayer to the Lord and the mercy of the Lord, his life might be spared. But now that he's dead, my prayers can do no more for him. I can't bring him back again. He will not come back to me, but I shall go to him. And after this, God gave to David and Bathsheba, his wife, another son. There we go. I had no idea they had a first one, whom they named Solomon. The Lord loved Solomon, and he grew up to be a wise man. I wonder who David's first child would have been. This is like news to me. I didn't realize he had a first child. I didn't realize he died. I wonder who he would have been. After God had forgiven David's great sin, David wrote the 51st Psalm in memory of his sin and of God's forgiveness. Some of its verses are these. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness, according to the multitude of thy tender mercies. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from mine iniquity and cleanse me from my sin, for I acknowledge my transgression, and my sin is ever before me. Against thee only have I sinned and done that which is evil in thy sight. Hide thy face from my sins and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence, and take not thy Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation, and uphold me with the free spirit. Then will I teach transgressors thy ways, and sinners shall be converted unto thee. For thou delightest not in sacrifice, else would I give it. Thou hast no pleasure in burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, O God, thou wilt not despise. That is it for tonight. I don't remember if it was Saul or it couldn't have been Solomon because he was wise. It must have been Saul. I forget the prophet, Jeremiah maybe? I don't know. When one of the kings, I think it's Saul, wants to kill a sacrifice himself, and it's not his place, it's a prophet's place, and the prophet is taking a long time to get to him, and they're going to have this big battle, and he wants to offer the sacrifice to get God's, approval before the battle. He's like, I can't wait for the prophet. Even though I'm not really authorized to do this, I'm going to do it myself. The prophet comes and said, shouldn't have done that. And then he also says, the Lord loves obedience more than sacrifice. And I really like that. So David fasted and wept and prayed and did all the things he could to make it right. And I'm not saying God doesn't, of course he does, but I think it's honestly a lot better in the first place. He would have just liked David to simply probably do the right thing. But I think the good news and the best news out of all that is we can turn around and be better. Okay, cool. Anyways, I like all of that. Hope you did too. And let's go ahead and read some more next time.